I read a great newsletter this week from veteran pollster Kos Samaras about One Nation's bouncing results and how on earth to interpret them. With far more nuance than me, he argued that polling isn't made for times like these. It's not politics as normal. It's a structural realignment of politics as we know it. In fact, of life as we know it. So rather than fixate on those polling numbers, follow the arc. Populist far-right politics is here to stay. The question I have now is whether One Nation can keep dominating this space in Australia. I'm Ashlynne McGhee from The Conversation, and this is the final episode of The Making of One Nation. Episode 6, Seize the Moment. Jill Sheppard, you're a political scientist at the Australian National University. Now, every punter has a view on One Nation, that it's peaked, it's flatlining, it's failing, it's flailing. It's about to take over the whole country. What about you? Where do you sit?
So at the moment, all we're talking about is One Nation. It feels like, they are on track to be the next government or be the next opposition. And there's a real disconnect between the control that One Nation has on the agenda at the moment and where they're likely to end up, politically speaking. Now, we saw in South Australia that they did poll really well.
One Nation surged ahead of the Liberals' primary vote, now on track to record its best result anywhere in nearly 30 years.
They got 23% of the primary vote, which is huge, bigger than the Liberal Party, but they weren't able to translate that into seats. And that's the main goal for a political party, is to convert votes into seats. They haven't quite mastered that yet. But there's a couple of reasons why I think that there probably is a realignment on the right at the moment in Australian politics, and that we'll see One Nation settle into a similar position to the Greens. First is that One Nation is really professionally run these days. There's a lot made of James Ashby and the way that he's managed to turn One Nation from a fringe sort of protest party to something that looks and feels a lot more like a major political party. That's pivotal to this story at the moment. The second is that I think there is a broader realignment of both issues and voter concerns on the right of Australian politics. What could happen on the right is that One Nation picks up this block of voters who at the moment are concerned about globalisation, they're concerned about both sort of regular and irregular migration. This is not necessarily a demographic that sits easily with the traditional Liberal Party.
I think a lot of people have always dismissed One Nation as, well, it's a protest vote. But those issues that they talk about, migration, the fear of globalisation, they're the same issues that propelled One Nation to power back 30 years ago. They're lasting issues. Can we still say it's a party of protest?
Look, I mean, any vote for anyone other than a major party is arguably a protest vote. You're saying, I don't like the parties of government. And so to vote for them is a deliberate choice. Now, preferential voting means that you can park your protest vote with one of these minor parties or even an independent. I think what's different about One Nation this time is that everything is dovetailing in their favour. The coalition is in disarray, and that's sort of glib and easy to say, but it does have this more structural disagreement internally around how they deal with globalisation, how they deal with migration. That's coming into stark relief after COVID and the borders being shut for a little while in conditions that allowed the coalition to put that debate on the back burner. So you've got an ostensible rise in migration. Voters are looking around saying, geez, this feels different. And at the same time, housing affordability is worse than it has been in a long time. Inflation keeps going up, so interest rates are going up at the same time. And if you're looking for a scapegoat, you've got this party that's been waiting in the wings with 30 years of experience by now, and this much more professionalised edge ready to take that vote. So I do think that technically it's a protest vote, but it's a protest vote that has a really important and structural base, and one that the coalition's going to have to either jettison and let One Nation be the party of low migration, and they can just deal with being a party that helps business and talks business's language, or they can try to fight them on these migration terms, and I don't know that they necessarily want that.
Yeah, right. So then with Donald Trump and his particular brand of far-right populism, Is that helping or hindering One Nation?
I think all the parties in Australia have a really tricky relationship with regards to Trump. Australian voters don't like him. There's so much polling on this. We don't like that style of politics, and we don't like his sort of disdain for political institutions. Now, One Nation, on the one hand, they want to ride that wave, and it is a wave of support for populist right parties across the world.
But the story making waves, Alternative for Germany, or AfD, scoring the best result for a far-right party since World War II.
Tonight, Italy is preparing for its first ever female prime minister and its first leader from the far right since the Second World War.
To Austria now, where for the first time since the Second World War, a far-right party has come top in the country's general election.
It's not necessarily that, James Ashby or Pauline Hanson are ringing up Trump's chief of staff to ask for advice, but, they are watching and learning. On the other hand, we don't have a real populist streak in Australian politics, even as we don't like our politicians, but we also really like Parliament. We really like the institutions that underpin politics, even if we don't like the actors involved. And that's going to be a really tricky obstacle course for One Nation, because on the one hand, you can't kick these institutions too much in Australian politics. But on the other, if they're learning from Trump, that's his modus operandi. So it's going to be fun. I shouldn't say fun to watch. It's going to be interesting to watch.
Everyone I've spoken to about this episode, they always have this upward inflection when you talk about whether One Nation can seize the moment, like this question mark at the end. So what do you think? Given their positioning now, given what's happening in Australia, given what's happening in the world, can they seize this moment?
I have really low expectations for what seizing the moment means for One Nation. I just think they don't want to go backwards. They're probably not going to win a handful of lower house seats. Now, the Greens won a by-election in 1996, I think, and that didn't lead to, a groundswell of support in lower house seats. They lost that immediately, went back to Labor, and everyone went about their day, and there was a weird blip in Australian political history. I think we'll see similarly with One Nation here. It's really hard for minor parties to translate votes into seats. There's a few reasons for this. One is that they simply don't have the resources. They don't have what we might call ground game to win these seats. They also have fairly geographically concentrated support, and that tends to be in rural and regional areas. Now, if they are able to translate that into either big enough support that they can knock off some nationals, I'm less convinced of that, especially since Matt Canavan has taken over the leadership of the Nats. I think that support for that party will rise again. Or if they can expand that support into the outer suburban areas and knock off what would have been Liberal Party seats, but that were in 2025 increasingly won by Labor. And I don't know that they're going to be able to do that because they're not really getting votes from Labor. They're really still just getting votes from the Liberals. And if the Libs don't hold those seats, I think they're going to struggle to win them back from Labor.
Jill, you mentioned ground game there and, how valuable that is when you're fighting elections or by-elections. But I've noticed One Nation seems to have a lot more money flowing in lately.
This aircraft is not for joyrides. This aircraft is for the battle for Australians.
I mean, they've got this sexy new plane, as Pauline Hanson says, but they also seem to have some serious cash flowing into the party.
So if we talk about the coalition's big problem as being how to balance concern about migration in the population with support for migration among their funders, One Nation's about to run into the same wall. If they're getting a lot of money from Gina Rinehart and from associated mining industries, they are going to have to confront this fairly existential problem where the people funding you and the people voting for you want fundamentally different things. Now, at the moment, this is all a bit of a joke, and she can laugh about her close relationship with Gina Rinehart.
A meeting between the country's richest person and One Nation leader Pauline Hanson is raising eyebrows this morning. Mining magnate Gina Rinehart snapped with the senator, having a meal believed to be in Thailand.
I think Pauline Hanson's a wholly owned subsidiary of Gina Rinehart. Pretty frequently, we see One Nation dance to Gina Rinehart's tune.
But there will be voters in the electorate right now who are telling pollsters that they're going to vote for One Nation, who look at that and go, gee, I don't know, this is not really the party that I thought you were. At the same time, though, that money from Gina Rinehart, it may help to win over other voters who are previously on the fence or persuaded by Pauline Hanson's pitch. So they'll be making that internal judgment, that calculus about whether it's better to take that money, aim a bit higher, shoot for the moon, run these big professionalised campaigns, or stay that grassroots, anti-elite, anti-business party that they have been for 30 years. Now, every party faces this crisis at some point in their growth, and I think how they deal with this will help to predict whether One Nation can remain that force on the right or whether they crash and burn.
After the break, is there a One Nation without Pauline Hanson?
I'm Gemma Ware, host of the Conversation Weekly podcast. Each week, I speak to an academic expert about a topic in the news to understand how we got here. From global politics.
World War II has this very long shadow in all of East Asia because there's a lot of unfinished business.
To the latest scientific breakthroughs.
The drug has been shown in real-world environments to be highly effective at preventing HIV.
Or the big dilemmas facing our planet.
We have actually stumbled in the last few decades into a system where those products that we rely on for the economy to be sold every day are polluting. And they're polluting things very badly indeed.
My guests draw on their deep research knowledge to pull out what really matters so that you can understand the context without the spin. Follow The Conversation Weekly for new episodes every Thursday wherever you listen to podcasts, and read more stories direct from academic experts every day on theconversation.com.
Jill, in terms of the party professionalising, the chaos and the internal blow-ups have really been its biggest issue over the past 30 years. Talk to me about the way you see it professionalising. What are you watching for? What are you noticing in particular?
I think in the early days, Pauline Hanson had a tendency to pop up and comment on everything. Now, that's fine when you're basically a freelancer, when the party is just you. What they've tried to do, and whether it's been successful or not remains to be seen, is to become a party that is more than just Pauline Hanson. These personalised populist parties tend to have a fairly short shelf life. Once the party or the voters turn on the person who is at the heart of the party, that's all they had, really. And with a hollow organisation below that one person, there's nothing else to vote for. And I think they have learnt from the rise and fall of similar parties, particularly through Europe, and they're trying to do something a little bit more substantial now. Now, the big obvious hinge point here was been recruiting Barnaby Joyce. I thought that would have crashed and burned by now, if I'm honest.
Former Deputy Prime Minister Barnaby Joyce has joined One Nation after leaving the Nationals in the final sitting week of Parliament.
His legacy is significant. That will be trashed if he goes to One Nation.
I thought that he'd probably been told that he would have the leadership of the party. Remember, this coincided with Pauline taking her name off the official party registration, so it's gone from Pauline Hanson's One Nation back to just One Nation. I thought this was maybe a sign that they would be changing the guard, and then they've pulled the rug from under Barnaby and that he would have blown up and been unhappy about that. I'm sure there's been screaming matches. I'm sure there's been internal feuds and serious disagreement about the future of the party. But they're keeping that secret. And the fact that they've been able to do that, for better or worse, right? It's not great for transparency. But the fact that they can do that says that this is a new type of One Nation now. They're not airing their dirty laundry. They're keeping these things secret, as a good political party should. Now, this sucks for democracy, right? This is why we don't like the major parties, because they don't thrash things out in public. They keep everything behind closed doors. Voters don't like it, but it's also what's expected. And so One Nation are deciding to play that game. They're taking money from Gina Rinehart. They're keeping their squabbles internal. Is this really what voters want from a populist right party? Maybe not. But on the other hand, they probably wouldn't have lasted as long as they have in this current resurgence without it. So it's really glib again, but it is a real catch-22 for a party that's trying to break into mainstream politics.
Okay, so let's go to that idea of a One Nation without Pauline Hanson. What is the succession plan, and does the party survive without her?
I think increasingly the party can survive without Pauline Hanson, and I don't think I would have said that 6 months ago. She is still remarkably popular, much more popular electorally than Barnaby Joyce is, and that's going to be a problem for them. So the next leader of One Nation might not be Barnaby Joyce. It might be someone in Pauline Hanson's image. It might be someone that's coming up through the state parliament. There's just been 4 South Australian MLAs elected for One Nation. Now, state parliament is traditionally a really good breeding ground for federal politicians. So you are going to get new generations of professionalised One Nation MPs. We all sort of chuckle at their surprise that they have to actually turn up in parliament. And sure, we can sort of point and laugh in a fairly condescending way right now. But being in parliament is the best way to learn about parliament, and they're going to learn about parliament. They're going to learn about politics from doing politics, and it is going to make them more fearsome. Whether that translates into sustained success, though, is still really contingent on the electoral system. And we still have an electoral system in the lower house that rewards the 2 major parties. So I think, much like the Greens, One Nation will continue to be much more of a force in the Senate than in the House of Representatives. And there's only so much you can do from the Senate. But you can still have this big public profile. And just like the Greens have managed to, on environmental issues, say, drag Labor to the left, I think we'll see One Nation do similarly no matter what House of Parliament they're in.
So, Jill, we talk a lot about is One Nation or will One Nation become the opposition? But what are the markers of that, other than, just boots on the ground, seats in Parliament, the actual numbers? What does it take to actually be the opposition?
Look, I don't think there's any way, and I'm regularly wrong, so maybe I'll be wrong about this, but certainly the maths suggests there's no way that One Nation becomes the official opposition in Australian politics. But right now, all we're doing is talking about One Nation. We're not talking about Angus Taylor. We're not even really talking about Matt Canavan. He can wear as many flannelette shirts and beanies as he wants on the ground in Farrow. We're not talking about him. We're still talking about Pauline. And she's charismatic. She's attention-grabbing. And so if part of the job of opposition is to lead the alternate agenda, to talk about things that the government isn't talking about, then we could say One Nation is already the opposition. Now, I think that tends to be overblown. I'm a traditionalist. I'm an institutionalist. I think that if you can't reasonably form government, if the government falls, then you're not the opposition. But on the same hand, I haven't been asked about Angus Taylor in at least 3 months.
3 months, wow. Politics is really changing, isn't it?
I think politics has always been about the agenda and who can set the agenda. It's just that we've tended to listen to the alternative government more than we've listened to anyone else on the fringes of Parliament or mainstream politics. We know that mainstream politics in Australia isn't popular. So I think this was always going to happen. We were going to have to talk about a different type of politics from what Labor and Liberal were giving us. You don't have a party win government with 34% or 36% of the primary vote without something being seriously wrong with the political system. And there hasn't been a force in Australian politics, probably since the Democrats, that's had such an effective command of the national agenda as Pauline Hanson has right now.
I think it's fair to say One Nation's policies and rhetoric can be racist, they can be divisive, and they can be offensive to a lot of people. Now, if you weigh that against the worth of having more parties in our political system, what do you think? Is it better for democracy?
Look, I think there are pretty unedifying views among a lot of people in society, and that's for better or worse. Often they don't find voice in the national media, and I think that's different about recent debates on migration. But there's always been fairly divisive and unpleasant opinions in the national political discourse. At the moment, it's concentrated around One Nation. Now, One Nation, if they want to win mainstream support, are probably going to have to shed some of their more divisive views. They might have to reconsider their position on someone like Ben Roberts-Smith. They might have to be a bit more willing to denounce people who attend neo-Nazi rallies, because that's not where the mainstream of Australian society is. Yes, it exists, but it's not something that an average person talks about or believes on the day-to-day. Now, this is going to be the challenge for One Nation. Do you keep making national news because you have these provocative views, or do you shift focus slightly and aim for a more mainstream voter and win more votes? It is particularly salient, I think, for One Nation because so much of their rhetoric and even their policies is around cutting Australia off from the rest of the world. It's about prioritising Australia first. It's about prioritising, whether they say it explicitly or not, white Australians first. These are not debates that the major parties want to have, but they're certainly debates that a small part of the population wants to have. And right now, that tail is wagging the dog.
What you're talking about there is really that ability to tell a story. And that's the thing that One Nation's always been really good at, I think, is telling this bigger story about what it means to be Australian. Come with us, this is who we are. I wonder if you think the major parties and establishment politics more generally in Australia, has it done a good enough job of telling and selling that story of what it means to be a modern Australian?
Look, I don't think the major parties have any real interest in talking about what it means to be Australian, because anytime you do that, you sort of include some people and you exclude others. And if someone feels like they're left out of that, sense of what it means to be Australian, they might not vote for you. And so that kind of risk aversion to losing votes, I think, has led to this inability or unwillingness to set out a clear direction for the future of Australia. And that isn't just fiscal policy. It's not just whether we tax superannuation or not. It's how we feel about ourselves as Australia. Now, for some Australians, that will be that we want to close our borders, that we want to become Fortress Australia, we want to be Australia first. But for the vast majority of voters, that is something a lot more multicultural. It's somewhere where we can come and go easily, where we can visit other countries, where people can visit us, where we might move overseas one day, and maybe people will come and live in Australia. But that's not a very provocative or interesting take on what it means to be Australia. So you have to prosecute it. You have to make people want to buy into that. And if the major parties aren't going to do that, then the only person talking about what it means to be Australian is Pauline Hanson.
So where is that narrative on the left? Think about those compelling, evocative Qantas ads. I still call Australia home. Where's that kind of nation-building storytelling?
I think liberal multiculturalism was the norm for so long that the major parties stopped talking about it. They thought that this had just been agreed, that this was what Australia would be. When you've got a sort of bipartisan compact on that, I think everyone just stopped talking about it. And you just say, well, we all agree. Don't you agree? Surely you agree if us elites in Canberra think so. And that's a really dangerous position to find yourself in. You stop arguing the merits of the thing that you've agreed on, and you're not necessarily bringing people with you. So when someone presents an alternative view, people are ready to hear that. Someone needs to talk about what it means to be Australian if you don't want it to be Pauline Hanson. Because if you're not going to talk about it, she's going to keep talking about it.
Jill, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks so much, Ashlynne. It's such a pleasure.
You can read more from Jill Sheppard at The Conversation. This is the final episode in our series, The Making of One Nation. If you missed any of them, you can go back and listen by searching The Making of One Nation on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you've liked this series, please leave us a review or send it on to a friend or even, a family member. It really helps others find us. This episode and the entire series was produced by Isabella Podwinski. Sound designed by Michelle Macklem. Our head of editorial innovation is me, Ashlynne McGhee. Misha Ketchel is the editor of The Conversation Australia. A special thanks to our colleagues Gemma Ware, Justin Bergman and Amanda Dunn for their ideas and wisdom. The Conversation is a not-for-profit media organisation. You can sign up to our free daily newsletter by clicking the link in our show notes. And you can also listen to more of our shows wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening. Until next time.